Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Super helpful. So today I'm talking about the writer of stuff, the man with two first names. Yes, that is Peter David. He has a brand new book, Mr. Sulu Grabbed My Ass. Excellent title, maybe one of the best ever. Subtitle being, and other highlights from a life in comics, novels, television, films, and yes, video games. Now, there's not much gaming stuff in here, unfortunately, but that's one of my very, very few gripes with the book. It mostly talks about Mr. David's work in comics, television, novels. He's written dozens of Star Trek novels. In fact, I've read quite a few of his Star Trek novels, his Next Generation novels and whatnot. Perhaps his most famous Star Trek novel is for the Next Generation, Mzadi. That's where he explores the romantic relationship between Counselor Troy and Commander Riker much further than the TV show ever did. Next Generation could kind of dance around this relationship, and it was super frustrating. But in this book, really goes into detail. Great stuff. Now, Mr. Sulu Grabbed My Ass is not his first nonfiction book. Back in 1994, he wrote But I Digress, which is a collection of his comics buyer's guide titles. Now, Peter David, if you don't know, super prolific. He's been a professional writer for well over 30 years. He's had acclaimed runs on The Incredible Hulk, Aquaman, Supergirl, Spider-Man 2099, and many other comic book titles. He's written a couple of episodes of Babylon 5. He's written for other television shows like cartoons, like Young Justice. Now, before I get to reviewing the book, I want to talk a little bit about how I discovered Peter David's work. So back in 1990, I was working at Lone Star Comics, a comic book chain, retail chain back in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now, if you go to mycomicshop.com, that's basically what Lone Star Comics has become. They no longer have stores, but they do sell stuff online. But for many years, beginning in the late 70s, it was a comic book store. And they had 8 stores at one point, and in 1989, I started working there in the back room, and over the course of a couple of years working there, I was the manager of a couple of stores, and the owner, Buddy, he subscribed to Comics Buyer's Guide. Now, the store didn't carry CBG, but he subscribed to it and have it in the back room. And when I worked there, there's Peter David's name right there on the cover. When I worked at Lone Star, I would read Comics Buyer's Guide, on my lunch break. And what's cool about this is Peter David wrote for Comics Buyer's Guide for 25 years up until, they stopped publication in 2013. It began, for many years it was a, tabloid-sized type publication, and then in later years it was a newsstand magazine. But so Peter David, he had a column there for a quarter of a century, and he talks about that in the book, how proud he is of that, because it's hard to come up with interesting, compelling material week after week or even month after month. But what's cool about this for me is I wrote for Comics Buyer's Guide as well for over a dozen years. So about half the time Peter David wrote his But I Digress column, I wrote for CBG. I wrote reviews for the publication, so it was always cool to have my name and my work in there along with Peter David's. Pretty neat, I thought, because he's a very acclaimed writer, New York Times best-selling author, and on and on and on. So McFarlane sent me this book, Mr. Sulu Grabbed My Ass. It's 219 pages. It has black and white photos. It is $29.95, which is a little pricey for, a small book like this, but that's McFarlane. Their prices are pretty high. They're an independent publisher. But anyway, it's worth it. They sent me a free copy, but I'd happily pay that. It's a good book. I really enjoyed it. Now, the title, Mr. Sulu Grabbed My Ass, is explained in the foreword. This occurrence, which you can read about, sort of helped inspire Peter to write this book, and I think it's just a lot of fun. It's a light, breezy read. Now, when I say that, that's not a left-handed compliment. He just doesn't get bogged down in politics and religion or too much heavy material like he sometimes does on Facebook. He has some really interesting, thought-provoking things about politics on Facebook, but he leaves that, he mostly talks about his career, his geeky stuff he's done throughout his life. Now, speaking of geeky, he talks about how, he was never a drinker, a drug taker, or anything like that. So I've read a lot of rock and roll, bios, and this is not that. This is not, there's not a lot salacious in here, although it is very interesting. He talks about the many celebrities he's met and interacted with and become friends with. Guys like Bill Mummy. Stephen King visited him at the hospital when he was in there for a stroke. Yep, Peter David had a stroke a few years ago. And he goes into a little detail about that. So there is some, weight, some substance, some tragedy in the book. There's some... It is pretty light and breezy overall, like I said, but he does get into the weeds a little bit for different topics. For example, like with Babylon 5, he really gets into the storytelling elements, how, working on that show and what that was like, and some really, if you're a Babylon 5 fan, you're going to want to know some of these anecdotes of him working on that show. So it's a nice balance between just light, breezy tales and some things that are a little more complex, a little more complicated. But like I said, he really doesn't get into religion and politics, which some of you will appreciate because, in the real world, we've heard so much, with political turmoil in the world. This book was a great escape for me to read. Really enjoyed it. So he talks about being Will Smith's bodyguard, which was really cool. He talks about, did he watch Star Wars with Mark Hamill? Sort of. And why exactly did George Takei, I should say, rhymes with gay. George Takei, why did George Takei grab his ass? That's pretty funny. Now, I did learn some new things in this book, like about a show called Space Cases, which he wrote with Bill Mummy, who played Will Robinson on the classic television show, the classic sci-fi show Lost in Space. Now, Peter David, through this book, you can tell he's very appreciative of his life. Now, he does talk about his ex-wife a little bit. He never gets salacious or throws personal insults at her, but he does talk about how after they divorced, he got really depressed and he was actually suicidal at one point because he was so down in the dumps, but he couldn't imagine leaving his kids behind. He's very complimentary of his kids about how much he loves them and his second and current wife. And he does talk about some family stuff. You might learn a little too much about Peter David, like he talks about, how he helped one of his daughters go to sleep by driving around. There's some minutiae in there you may not care about. You may learn more about Peter David than you wanted to know. But hey, that's just part of an autobiography. He talks about what's important to him, what he thinks might be important to you guys, and most of it, or maybe all of it, will be. If you're really geeky, if you love science fiction and comics and, Star Trek and all that stuff, you're absolutely going to enjoy this book quite a bit because Peter David, he's very well known for being funny. His But I Digress columns were often very humorous. His Facebook posts are funny. He'll dig into certain politicians and be amusing that way. And yes, Mr. Sulu, Grabbed My Ass is a funny read. And you may not want to sit down and just binge this in for a few hours in one afternoon. It's probably better reading 2 or 3 chapters at a time. And he talks about how just fortunate he is to grow up. Just like when he was a teenager, he got to interview William Shatner thanks to author Robert Ludlum. Pretty darn cool. And he just talks about how surreal it is that, he's met all these famous people and befriended many of them, like Harlan Ellison, the late great author. And he talks about how, 85%, according to a poll, 85% of the people in the U.S. hate their jobs. And he considers himself, part of the fortunate 15 who loves his job. But he also talks about, moving forward in the future, the publishing industry is much different than it used to be. It's much harder to sell books. Book sales aren't what they used to be. You can't make as much money as an author, unless you're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or somebody. You can't make as much money as an author as you used to be, as a mid-list author. So he does talk about, some of the good, some of the bad, with his career. And like I said, there's some details you may or may not care about. And he does like him some adverbs. Like there's this one sentence I read that was it kind of cracked me up. He talks about his incredibly warm brown blanket. Now, isn't incredibly warm actually hot? But I digress, so to speak. Who am I to tell Peter David, the acclaimed New York Times best-selling author, that he uses too many adverbs? Tiny gripe with this really, really good, really funny, really amusing, really informative book. If you like pop culture, if you like science fiction and comics, Star Trek and all that good stuff, if you really want to get into the weeds on some of the, behind the scenes writing stuff, if you're a writer, you definitely want to read this book. You will absolutely enjoy it. I don't typically grade stuff, 1 out of 10 or whatever, but I'd give this book a good solid 8 or 9. Really enjoyed it. All right, guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Let me know, what is your favorite Peter David book or, television show or comic book that he's written? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. We will talk to you guys in another video.